Yep, and here we go, live on Speak Out Cafe Bubble. Hi, everyone who's listening. My name is Alexander Damian-Ricci. I'm from the Cafe Bubble crew, and I'm really happy today to host two special guests to kick off a discussion on Are Fridays for Future from the Past? A critical discussion on what happened to climate movements and social movements in Europe on climate over the past COVID year. And we are here today with Adelaide Charlier.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, Adelaide, co-founder of Youth for Climate from Belgium. Thanks for being with us. And with Patrick Czarkowski, who is journalist at Gazeta from Poland in Warsaw today, I guess.
Hi, happy to be here.
Hi, guys. Thanks for being with us. As I said, today we are going to discuss what is happening to the social movements across Europe who take care about climate issues. And we have given a bit, a provocative title, of course, to this conversation, Are Fridays for Futures from the Past? And the reason why we want to have the discussion actually is because we had a writer from our network, Rita Cantalino from Italy, and I'd like the Cafe Bubble crew who was helping us as a backup maybe to highlight the article. She wrote an article on what happened over the past year in Italy to movements like Fridays for Future and Extinction Rebellion. And the outcome is a bit that, these social movements have been a bit kind of neglected by the media landscape over the last year. And this is particularly so because they have maybe been a bit more political over the past year, attacking maybe some big companies in Italy. So she puts before this topic actually, that social movements on climates are nice until they don't get on the feet of anyone. What happens instead when they attack someone? Well, the picture changes slightly. So this is the kickoff for the show today. Adelaide, I want to kick off with a question for you. Social movements in Belgium, what is your experience? How has been this last year? Was it tough for you to get in touch with the media? Have you been covered? Give us your view on matters.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here tonight. I think that in Belgium, we did have a kickoff at the start of our movement, which was, of course, before the pandemic, with a real chance of media attention, thanks to the little civil disobedience that we were doing, which was only skipping school and being massively present in the streets. So that, of course, the media liked and were really present for us, which helped for our movement to grow. I cannot talk much about this question of as soon as we get a bit further into, for example, civil disobedience or pointing at a certain companies, would that make media more scared? Because our movement focuses mainly on politicians and stays into, I don't know if I can say this, a low stage of civil disobedience. So maybe we don't disturb enough in our movement. So then we get media attention. But what is for sure present in our movement for the past year, and we know we are not the only ones, and there I can really relate to the article, is that since COVID has happened, it is quite impossible to get media attention except if you cover the word COVID, or if you link whatever you want to put forward to that pandemic. But anything that comes next to that pandemic is seen as background information that is not really necessary, except if we have time and space in media, which is actually really, really scary, because such a pandemic, has grown from somewhere, and there is other problematic in this world that we have to keep informing citizens about, like the climate crisis, for example, which is completely being ignored a lot by media for the moment. So, and I'm talking as a climate activist, but there is, of course, also many other problematics who are completely being ignored today, because there is this real focus on COVID. So that is really a struggle for us. We've been not able to get the attention that is needed around also important summits where we try to put a maximum of pressure, and our actions, which have to be very creative, because we cannot be, massively present in the streets because of COVID actually do not interest media as much because maybe they don't get the right images. But the problem is that we still need to be out there, right, sharing that message.
Right. So COVID, I feel like it has been a major blow actually to the visibility somehow. Patrick, I think interesting insight. So from your perspective in the media sphere, have you experienced the same? Can you give us, it's a different perspective. I mean, Adelaide talk from a social movement kind of perspective. What's your take on the matter?
So yeah, obviously the pandemic has dominated our work in the media because I mean sometimes just resource wise, especially in the first months where there was at work we covered hardly anything else because there was so much going on. It was so new, and over time I think that's changed and. There is coverage of the youth protests and another climate protest in Poland. It's really hard to compare whether it's less or more than before the pandemic because the situation is so different. Also when you talk about what's actually going on, what are the forms of the process and so on. And they have not always been well. Obviously, during lockdowns and so on, there were no big protests. But then in summer last year, when the rules were eased, where it was allowed to gather in public and so on, there were some bigger street protests and so on. And actually, some of first like more prominent civil disobedience actions, like blocking the streets and so on. And that definitely did get media attention. Like besides, I was there covering this for our website, but also I saw colleagues from TV, from radio. So that was for a brief moment all over the news. What I think the movement is still struggling with, which is maybe unrelated to the pandemic, but more to what the media is, how the media is covering the climate crisis. That the many outlets, many journalists are still like focusing too much on this like eco lifestyle and like personal choices and so on. So I saw some colleagues, some journalists do interviews, for example, with activists from Extinction Rebellion on the street, and they were not really asking about the climate crisis, but like whether they save electricity at home and so on. So this is something that gets the activists upset, understandably so, and this is something that they are struggling with, as well as the attention. Maybe also just one more sentence. That I think the protests are getting a lot of attention when they're something new. Like this protest last I think August or September, when those for the first time the activists were blocking the streets in Warsaw, that got a lot of attention. But then now there are some, like for example, one person protest, some single activist blocking the streets on something, and this doesn't get as much coverage. It's a smaller protest, and also it's not that new, so this is maybe not really that interesting for majority of the media.
Right. So if I understand it correctly, there's even a different kind of sensibility kinds of sometimes when people go on the ground, reporters to covering climate protests nowadays. In at least I guess you're talking for Poland right now, in your experience, of course, I guess. We have something interesting to show to our audience, who is mostly invited to comment, of course, on wherever they follow the stream. We can take in questions from Facebook and YouTube. We have seen, for instance, that there has been a shift, of course, during the COVID crisis from physical protests to more kind of online campaigns. And we wanted to show there was an instance of a protest from really far away, India, Fridays for Future India, which has done some online campaigns on Instagram. I don't know if we can show something. I think here it comes. So obviously, I mean, as these are digital times. Can online protests really take the place of what is going on the streets, or to what extent, Adelaide?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because we have, of course, shift our actions mostly on social media, like most people, because of what's happening with the pandemic. It's for sure we had some impacts. We had some campaigns that really did work. You mentioned a campaign that Fridays for Future in India held, and it really got pretty far. And they, of course, also had the support of Fridays for Future internationally. But on the European level, for example, we had a very strong campaign against the CAP, which is the Common Agriculture Policy on the European level, and that we were really able to make our campaign so big that this was an argument inside the European Parliament, and Ursula von der Leyen had called the Commission on an urgency meeting to talk about this. So we were able to get some impact there and at least make some people scared inside those institutions. But we do have to be honest that campaigning on social media and sharing a message on social media leaves you most of the time inside your bubble and inside people that already understand and are okay with your message, but you don't reach usually further than that. So you don't break that climate bubble, for example. When we are in the streets, we are annoying everyone that is there, whatever is your background, whatever your political ideas are, we are there and we are annoying you, so you don't really have the choice to see us and to we impose ourselves like publicity are imposed on our screens, are imposed in the streets, and there it was a way for us to kind of impose our message. So for sure we don't do that when we are on social media. It is for sure less interested for media. We have mostly used social media the past year and not media because we don't really know how to get to them anymore. So we use our social media and we hope to get our platforms bigger, to have a bigger impact, and not using media anymore. So we cannot say that social media has the same impact as streets actions, and the movement is for sure really excited to go back into the streets to have a bigger impact.
Do you agree with this, Patrick? Or at least would an online campaign, even if massive, get the same attention of something similar happening on the streets?
So I think it's a very good point what you said, that online it's harder to get outside of your bubble. And then as far as the media attention goes, yeah, I think it's much harder because online you have just so much content, so many campaigns. You have dozens of actions as a journalist. I get so many messages, emails, and so on about campaigns, and just for the environment, and there are also many other issues and so on, and they rarely get as much attention. Maybe if something gets very, very big, but I don't see it happening that often in Poland. For example, what you mentioned about CAP, I have seen this trending, yes, in other countries on Twitter in English or in other languages and so on. But in Poland, it got barely any attention. I remember writing a short article myself just about with some comments from activists from Greenpeace in Poland and so on. And I know that some youth activists were tweeting about this and sharing the information on social media, but it did not get much attention really. So yeah, I think it's just very difficult because there is so much online that it makes it difficult to get the attention.
I totally agree. I think that one of the biggest, I think, results of the whole social movement world universe, of movements over the past 5 years or so was actually to bringing again people on the streets. Right, we were kind of not used to that anymore, I feel. And it was cool to see that actually. And even in Rome, we had massive. I'm speaking from Rome today. I didn't mention that, but we had massive, protests even in Rome. I wanted even to, draw upon an article which was published in Deutsche Welle again, which was mentioning the campaign in India actually, and the words I quote from a researcher whose name is Moritz Sommer. And he works at the DESIM Institute in Germany. And I quote, he says, "We know from our data that direct social encounters like the dimension of protests play a huge role in motivating young people to go on the streets. And this is obviously missing when you can only meet online. So it's not only actually an impact on the people who are outside of your bubble, but even those who are potentially in your bubble and they are not mobilized. Do you agree with that? Adelaide or Patrick, anyone who wants to answer?
I personally really agree. I'm sorry, I'm gonna come in here, sorry. But I really do agree, because there is a lot of people following us and wanting to mobilize, that come to us sometimes and be like, hey, what can I do? And that is really, of course, a hard question for us, because we're like, oh, we've been proposing so many different online actions for the past months, and every Friday there's always something that can happen. But it's really hard to include everyone, because there are different platforms, different timing zones if you work with an international movement. And so to be able to reach everyone somehow is quite almost impossible. So if you build yourself up towards, one certain date where there's this one action that everybody has to do, for example, that really works for Fridays for Future, when we see that we have to build up our mobilization for a global strike where we all know where to work upon, where to work towards to, that really works. When we have to mobilize every week on social media, that is very different. And clearly, again, we don't have the same impact now that we had when we were mobilizing in the streets every Friday a year ago. So for me, that's clearly, again, a good point to mention here.
Right. Patrick, do you want to?
I'd say, that I think it's just hard to be online that much, when you're working online, or you're a student or at university. Your day is, turning on your computer, being online for 8 hours or more. And then, and if your activism is just being online for 2 more hours, it's just, I think it's tiresome and difficult. And when, again, coming back to this event last year in Warsaw, before the Extinction Rebellion actually went out to the street to protest, they had a whole weekend of just like a small festival in a park in Warsaw, where over 2 days they had meetings, they had lectures, discussion with scientists and activists and so on, and they were also teaching each other how to be safe in the protest and so on. And I think that was extremely mobilizing for people who participated, to feel to be in this place. To get into this interaction, to actually meet people and so on. So I think it's necessary, and I hope that the situation that with vaccinations rolling out and so on, the situation will be better, so to allow more of events like this to go on, because I think most people are just looking forward to it, for just for their wellness, let's say.
I'm taking in here a question which comes from Leah, our colleague, from YouTube. Adelaide, have you participated to online campaign coordinated between some countries and not only national level? Can you give us some about that?
Yes, of course. We actually, thanks to the pandemic, and I think there can be some positive sometimes, thanks to social media. Also, we can be in contact with people from across the world with our movements, and so we can campaign together at the same moments on a specific things. So clearly, that is what we have been doing during this pandemic, is looking inside our movement and seeing how can we work together, and especially go beyond our borders, because, for example, I stand in Brussels. If we want to put pressure on the European level, not only Brussels activists can do that, we have to do it as activists from Europe. And so we have to go beyond our borders. And that's what we've been doing. For example, when I've mentioned the CAP campaign, it was clearly a campaign that was on a European level, and it sometimes even support from an international level. Today we have different campaigns around different banks, where we really focus on different banks, and no matter where they stand, like where the bank stands, we are all focusing on that bank and putting pressure on it. So that's clearly what we've been doing during this pandemic, is knowing that if we do it actually only on a national level and we want to point our fingers towards an institution that is European or international, we won't make it happen. So we have to use our strength, which is actually having a global movement, to make sure to get that. And so it's clearly what we're doing today. Yes.
Patrick, wouldn't you say that but I think it's interesting what Adelaide says, but by focusing on global institutions, most of the times those global institutions then don't have necessarily the force to act specifically then on local fights and matters. Isn't there somehow I wouldn't say it's incoherent, but there is somehow, how would you say that in English? I don't know, but it's a problem, I think, when we put so much pressure on global institutions, but then who acts is actually the nation state most of the time, right? And so do we risk protesting a lot and then getting no action actually?
So actually, from my perspective in Poland, this is something that really works, because when you look at the action of the government, they are like slowly progressing towards climate action. It's still nowhere near enough, but still it's a progress. And this is happening mostly because of what's happening in EU, I'd say, So this changes the European Green Deal and all of this. Also the recovery fund that will have a percentage going to climate action and so on. So yeah, most of the changes that are going on in Poland, and as far as climate, is because of the EU, because the current government, it was really against climate action. It was pro coal and so on. And the good things that are, well, not really good, but the small progress that is happening is because of the pressure of the EU. And now perhaps with Joe Biden in the White House, there will be also pressure from Washington, which is a very important ally for Polish government. So from my perspective, it is important to pressure these big institutions, because this will really influence the situation in Poland, maybe even more than what's going on locally.
Right. Patrick, let me ask you, we have actually another question from social media. So Margot asks, I think it's again a question for Adelaide. Do you highlight the MAPA most affected people and areas in your online campaigns? I think it's an important one.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so actually that is, so MAPA, which is most affected people and areas, is really something that we try to put forward as a movement, Fridays for Future. There is several campaigns now that we try to that have to be led today by MAPA. Why? Because we strongly believe that stories have to be told by people who are already affected by climate change, people who are facing this every day. I am here, a white, privileged European young girl, and I am not literally facing climate change, the consequences at least. And so for that, I have to be able to make sure that the stories of MAPA activists are actually put forward. And so we have several campaigns that are actually led by MAPA. For example, the campaign from last week, where we were focusing on the Biden summit. We have written, Fridays for Future wrote a letter to to Biden, and this letter was only written by MAPA activists. This whole campaign was led by MAPA activists, and us, as for example, me as an activist that does not don't consider myself as a MAPA activist. I am there to make sure I support, I collaborate, and we make sure that this moves forward and that we continue. But the story and the message that is being shared needs to come from MAPA activists. So clearly we are doing this. We are doing campaigns with MAPA activists. We are making sure that they are leading these campaigns, that their message are the ones who are brought forward. And we clearly have to continue this, and we are probably not there yet and probably not perfect yet, but we are really working on this.
Right. Patrick, it's true that MAPA is important, but at the same time, even miners in Poland are important. And how will they end up with all the climate change, right? And policies which might change their natural employment habitat, right? We have We have dealt with this in another project, which is led by Cafe Babel, which is Feda, which kicked off this week. But it's a difficult political choice, is it or isn't it?
So it's presented as difficult, but it's not really when you look at the data and so on. With the miners, it's really a very broad topic. We'd have to talk about history and of Poland and so on. But really, to put it very in few sentences, the mining business was extremely important in the communist era because of the central planning, connection to Soviet Union, and so on, exporting coal to Soviet Union. And the miners, they had a lot of privileges. They were earning much more than average people and so on. And then what happened in the 19th when Poland transformed into the democratic states, a lot of miners were really left behind. There was a huge transformation. You can also see it in the emissions in Poland that fell drastically, not because it was meant to, but because of the business that was unprofitable just shut down when the communists ended, and tens of thousands of people just were unemployed overnight. And that is a big wound in Silesia and in the coal mining region. It has somewhat healed because it's been 30 years, but the scar is there. So people are really afraid of this transformation, and they really want to keep their jobs and so on.
Right.
So but the reality is, and this is why just one sentence. The reality is that now there is not that many mining jobs left. It was, I think, 400,000 in the end of the 80s, and now it's 80,000. And a lot of them are people who would go to who would retire anyway before 1930 something, which would be a realistic day to end coal in Poland. So the big issue is that the government is just not being honest. They are promising the miners that they will keep their jobs until 2049, and it's just not true. It's not going to happen. There's no way that the mines will still operate for 30 years, and it's really a shame because the transition is now is possible. We have the know-how, we have funds from the EU to really make this transition not like a shock doctrine that it was in the 90s, to make it
more smooth.
More smooth. Yes. Yeah. To make it smooth, but the government is just not doing that.
Right. I think that nevertheless, it's an important political tool for conservative forces. These are jobs everyone knows from movies, and from films, etc. So it's really powerful as a tool to build up a narrative against policies against climate change. Speaking of EU, Patrick, another question we have from Gabriel is: do you think? Well, it's even for Adelaide, of course. Afterwards, I just change the order of the questions once. Do you think the conference on the future of Europe, could be a way to reactivate the mobilization for climate? This question brings us a bit back on the topic of our discussion originally. So if Fridays for Futures are from the past, or if there can be, a new wave, how would you answer that question, Patrick?
Well, I think it remains to be seen. I mean, it's hard to predict anything, and I think that the dynamic of what's going on with the pandemic and with climate action and so on, it's just I would not dare to predict whether this will really reactivate the mobilization. But I think that this will happen anyway. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe the conference will help, but. Anyway, I think that this is the way forward, that the activists, they also will, as you mentioned earlier, that there are also new, more creative ways to protest and so on. But also there's more attention anyway, maybe less, the pandemic decreased the attention to protests and so on, but this hopefully will end at some point, and now people are more and more aware of the climate crisis, and so I think the protests will go back to being as prominent and more as before at some point. But I don't know whether there will be just one, particular point that will reactivate the movement.
Right, Adelaide, what do you think about the Conference for the Future of Europe? For some, it's a rhetoric moment. Just, do you think it can have an impact? Will it have an impact, or is it not important for the discussion of tonight?
No, I think hopefully it will be. But first of all, the movement is still mobilizing today, and we're not waiting for that conference to happen to mobilize citizens. So clearly, like here in this question, what I'm really saying is again that it's this problem where we're trying to mobilize, and maybe we don't reach everyone again, because we do mobilize. We have mobilized last month for a big global action, and we are doing that again and for different campaigns, and we keep on asking people to keep on mobilizing, which is of course online. So maybe for physical mobilization, hopefully yes, if COVID allows us to do it, and if we can, if there's a hype around this conference that can allow us to take more space and bring back the attention around this climate crisis. Hopefully, yes. But yeah, honestly, it's we all hope so. But let's not forget that the movement is still mobilizing today, and we're not going to wait for a conference to happen to mobilize.
Right. I think that we had an interesting item I wanted to show you and our audience is that Ipsos has done a survey in I think February this month. I hope that the Cafe Bubble crew can help us showing that graph. It's basically, it was a pan-European survey, and what it did is to analyze mobilization across different European countries. And the survey was done on young people between 15 and 35 years of age in 23 EU countries. And the main question, one of them was if they had participated to peaceful demonstration in green nonviolent protests to ask political action. And you are looking right now at the data, basically. And the main result, obviously, is that there are differences in Europe and how people have participated in this type of protests. And we see that Spain appears to be a leader. Whereas I would say, roughly said, that Poland is at the end of the first line, as we can see. And what is your perception on this? How have protests been different across Europe in your perception? Have there been specific countries where you think it's more of an issue than in other countries, for instance? Patrick or Adelaide, whoever wants to go first. From your experience, which can be very different. I mean, have you seen one country which, clearly took the lead on this?
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, of course, I can try. Now, I think here it's really tricky because it depends on every country. And honestly, it's like what we always say as the movement of Fridays for Future is that we have to be able to mobilize depending on what is the best way to mobilize in our own countries. I'm actually surprised that Belgium doesn't have a higher number, but that's but honestly, yeah, it depends on the culture of the country, and if this is part of how the country helps to put how the culture of the country has built up to put pressure on citizens or on politicians to see if actually protesting is one of the way to do it or if there's others. But it differs on most of the country. But what's also would be really interesting to look at is comparing this to countries beyond our European borders, because I've been, for example, in Brazil, where their Fridays for Future exists and is very present, but they cannot strike like we do on Fridays, because that would be a real danger. And second of all, it would also be a real issue for most students if they have access to school. Will mostly privilege the fact that they can go to school and not skip that. So it's also a real privilege today, for example, to skip school, which is one of our main actions as Fridays for Future.
Right. Patrick, what is your perception on how these movements have spread across Europe?
So I think judging because I have not been to a climate protest in another European country, actually, just in Poland. I have been to one in Colombia, and that would be a bit, as Adelaide said, that they were the people they were saying that, you know, for them it's quite dangerous to protest and so on. So this is a really different situation. And but like just seeing from Polish perspective, I think that it's really different and specific to each country, because when I see like how our protests in Poland fit into, you know, things that are going on in the political scene and so on. For example, there were some last year there was the ruling that banned almost all banned abortion in almost all cases. And there were big protests, and there were also climate activists like participating in this protest, because a lot of the climate activists, they are people, especially those who participate in protests on a regular basis or just often. They are activists in other issues as well, social issues and so on, you know, women rights, LGBT rights, and so on. So there is really a lot of context to how the protests look and how the protests are changing in Poland. And I imagine this is the case, you know, in different European countries as well, that you have your local issues that also play into this in a lot of ways, you know, like, I don't know, like unemployment, or in Germany, the nuclear energy, which is a big topic. So I think, yeah, on the other hand, the bottom line, the main message is something that definitely connects them. And this is something that I have seen also in this protest in Colombia, that, you know, there were also a lot of similarities in what the people are saying.
Right. Adelaide, how do other social movements play into Fridays for Future and climate movements? What has been the interaction? Has there been collaboration? Is there a lot of overlap, as Patrick suggests, or not?
Yeah. First of all, Fridays for Future focuses a lot on the climate change aspects, but of course, we also understand that the question is deeper than just limiting, for example, the planet from CO2 emissions. You know, it's a real. We really question the whole system itself, because we also see inequalities across the world, and even in our own country, for example, in Belgium, that we also want to be able to put forward in our message. So clearly, for example, speaking for Belgium, there, like, for what has happened in Belgium, we have been collaborating with other social movements. We have been walking in the streets with the Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vests, with the syndicat, with the unions. So it's not only a question of CO2 and climate, it's really a question of the whole system, that we want to include the other problematics, because if we want to build this world for tomorrow, if we want to build something new, something creative, we want to make sure that we don't only solve one of the problems that we are facing today, but the others also, and that we include them in that transition towards a new world. So that's for sure something that
Adelaide, sorry, let me follow up on this. Does this message come across, in your opinion? Has it been successful? It's important what you're saying, but I would argue that it's not always the case how the message came across in the media.
Of course, I think it's something that we put forward all the time as people who like Fridays for Future representatives who speak to the media, is really something that we try to put forward. If the media doesn't want to take it, again, there is gatekeeping here. There is filters that we cannot always, have an impact on. But it's a message that we have been putting forward more and more. And to be honest, at the start of our movement, for example, Youth for Climate here in Belgium, this was clearly not a message that we were putting forward. It has been throughout the movement, when we are growing, when we learn more, when we are informing ourselves, when we are starting to create collaboration, for example, and coalitions with, for example, indigenous communities in the Amazon forests in South America. That is when we realize, okay, now we have to broaden our message. Now we have to include this in our message. And so hopefully that message is changing more and more, and people can see it. And that's what we are working on. For example, also again with MAPA Activists, which is really now a new message from Fridays for Future, but that we hope will come across.
Patrick, are you a gatekeeper? Do you let this message across or not?
I try to. I think I try to get the message across. I think I try to do my best. As I said, I hope. I think one of the issues for journalists is, as I mentioned earlier, not really understanding what the climate crisis is about. Basically, focusing on personal action and so on. And I hope I hope this will change. And when you look at Polish media as well, I think things are going in a good direction. We're not there yet, but when you look at how the attention has shifted towards the climate crisis, there's definitely more attention, more coverage, and I definitely think this is also thanks to the activists who are protesting, who are bringing these issues to the media. Actually, the activists, the Extinction Rebellion in Poland, I think last year or 2 years ago, they have been directly, talking with the media. They were going to newsrooms, to newspapers, to TVs. They had like their list of well, not really demands, but something that they ask the media to do to better cover the climate crisis. They talked with editors. So I think this is not always working. But in many cases, yes. And also the activists, they educate journalists as well. When a journalist asks, I'm coming to this again, but when a journalist asks, are you saving water at home, and the activists can say on national television, this is not really the point. And I think this is great, and I think that the activists are doing really great job, not just getting the attention, but also like educating the media and changing the discourse.
Fair enough, and I think that in certain moments, I think historically one can, be an activist for certain things and a journalist at the same time. Obviously, distinguishing all the times where you're doing your job and not. I would like to close this chat with you guys on our Fridays for Futures from the past, and I think a good closing question for both of you would be: what is, in your opinion, the main challenge now in the light of the year which has passed? What is the main challenge for the movements which deal with climate change? If you had to pick one specific challenge on the road to reactivate, I mean, I know that Adelaide said it's going on, but if you have to pinpoint one challenges, what would it be? Adelaide.
Yes, I think there is several challenges, because in the movement there is always something to improve. To start with, I think there is this main challenge of making sure that we don't only mobilize activists, but that we mobilize civil society. And this is a real big challenge for the moment for our movement, that we go beyond our bubbles, and that we are able to, again, be back for civil society. So this is biggest challenge. And I cannot forget also the challenge of making sure that we put forward people already affected by climate change, and not only privileged activists.
Fair enough. Patrick, how do you see?
I think these are both good points. One that I would add is that it's important to keep the people informed that we're not there yet, because some people may think that there's so much talk now about climate action and the promises of the politicians and so on, that some people might think that we're fine. So to keep the message that we're not there yet, that we have to still keep the fight. And sadly, another thing in Poland is a challenge is the growing violence from the state, from the police. This is something that I would not expect to happen in Poland, but in last year, this has really marked the protest, that there's increased violence and increased more court cases and so on. The state is using the pandemic, the restriction as a tool to fight, basically all anti-government protests. So there are, for example, activists who have court cases for organizing protests, and I would never expect this, but yeah, this is a growing challenge for activists in Poland.
Good point, and this connects us back again to the first thing we mentioned, the article in Cafe Babel, where Rita Cantalino actually dealt with these kind of instances where, I mean, legal consequences can be tough as violence sometimes to hinder a movement, I may say so. Or it can be a huge deterrent, to let people go on the streets. Thanks again for being with us today, Adelaide and Patrick.
Thank you for
Thank you. It
inviting
was
us.
great talking to you.
And we will be back with Speak Out by Cafe Babel in the next weeks. Have a great evening all.
Thank you.